everyone, members and guests. This is our third talk of 2021, which is a pretty packed programme. And I know we've got members joining us for the first time, so a particular welcome. And if you live in Saffron Walden, particularly welcome to you. Most of you know Jules, who's organised this evening, our secretary, and I'm Sue, the chair of the Thorney Island Society. Victor Keegan, one of our committee members, spoke 2 weeks ago on Where is Thorney Island? And that's a particularly perfect setting for us this evening, when Julie is going to talk this evening about her book, Plague. So thanks for great timing, Jules, for setting that up. So Julie Anderson, our speaker, is going to be talking about her latest book, Plague. She's a writer, and she's a former senior civil servant who worked for many years in the Palace of Westminster. So that's the setting for her Westminster thriller, and it really is the first, I think, for us. So that's really very exciting to have an author and a writer. Marvellous. So Julie's going to be speaking for about 40 minutes, 35, 40 minutes, and we'll have a Q&A afterwards as usual. So if you want to pop your name and question into the chat, at the end, our Jules will ask you to ask your question directly to Julie. So there's that real interaction between the speaker and the questioner. Or if you prefer at the end, just put up your hand through the on the screen, and we'll try and find you, and that will be great. So I think that's the end of the preliminaries. So over to you, Julie.
Well, thank you. I'll just go into my my talk, and at least that's what I'm trying to do now, and we'll start from the beginning. Here we are. Now, my book is entitled Plague. First of all, I'd like to thank you for inviting me to talk to you this evening. It is with some trepidation that I do this, because the Thorney Island Society members will probably know as much, if not more, about Thorney Island than I do, even though much of the plot of Plague is determined by that particular place. The book itself was first published, I don't know quite how to get rid of this. Jules, do you know? No. The book itself was first published last year, and it's the first in a series, the second of which features the same central character, is called Oracle, and will be published on the 5th of May in a couple of months' time. And the third, which is called Opera, is scheduled for 2022. Now, I have to say, first of all, that Plague is not a COVID, nor even a pandemic novel. The title is a metaphor, and as the tagline above the title there says, the plague in question is a moral one. It is power that is the contagion in the novel. Now, a little bit about me. I am indeed, as Sue has said, a former senior civil servant, and I worked in Whitehall for many years in a series of different government departments, including the Office of the Deputy Prime Minister, the Inland Revenue, and my final posting, which was at the Commission for Equality and Human Rights. But I began writing Plague back in 2018, when I anticipated having surgery, and I knew that I would suffer an enforced period of inactivity, and I'd have plenty of time to write. I'd been approached by Claret Press, which is an independent press, to write a crime thriller, which is completely new for me. This is the first time I've entered that particular genre. But for me, it was really very simple when I began to think about where I should set my crime thriller. It had to be Whitehall because it was a world that I knew so very well. My origins, I'm not a Londoner. I moved to London at the end of the 80s, but I confess that I am with Dr. Johnson when I think that, you know, he who is tired of London is tired of life. And I very much wanted Plague to be a novel of London. Most of the action takes place in SW1, but I also wanted to capture the vibrancy and the cosmopolitan nature of the capital, because it's something which I find extremely stimulating, and I love living here. It's also, of course, a centre of power, and it has been the centre of power for a very long time. It's the centre of regnal power, but also as a capital, first of England, then of the UK, and actually of empire too. It's been at the centre of things for such a long time. The city, of course, is also a financial powerhouse, although we see that start leaking away a little bit now. It's a huge generator of economic power. Although I also wanted to capture, in certain respects, the inequalities of London. So there is a homeless character in the novel, and a young couple who are trying hard to make ends meet. I wanted to explore all kinds of power in the novel, which I hope I'm successful in doing. Most of it, as I say, happens around SW1. This is the power postcode. You have powers temporal, the Houses of Parliament there, and then you've got Downing Street up here. Powers spiritual, Westminster Abbey, Westminster Central Hall, and not far away, Westminster Cathedral. And you also have legal power in the old Middlesex Guildhall, which is now, of course, the Supreme Court. Used to be power resided in the House of Lords, but that has subsequently changed. It's also one of the most expensive places to live in London. And here we can see a photographic representation of exactly those sort of powers. There you've got the Elizabeth Tower with Parliament, and the Abbey and St Margaret's. Here, Methodist Central Hall. Have the offices of state. This is the HMRC and the Treasury you see here, and the Foreign Office, Foreign and Commonwealth, with backing onto St James's Park. You can't quite see the Supreme Court, but it's tucked behind the Treasury building. You have Portcullis House, the modern extension to the Palace of Westminster. The two Norman Shaw buildings, which were, of course, the original New Scotland Yard, and the Curtis Green building, which is the current home of the Metropolitan Police. Now, I was fascinated by Thorney Island and its history and the concentration of power within that very small area. And I put these words into the mouth of my protagonist in Plague. I find it fascinating, she said, looking back at the palace. So much power being concentrated within this small area, all because centuries ago, the ground of old Thorney Island was a bit higher than the Thames marshes around it. And one of the fascinations for me of Thorney Island and the land around it it's not just the surface, but the subterranean. So the layers of the past. Now, in any place of human, which has been a place of human habitation for centuries, you will get layers of history underfoot. And frequently, we'll come across them as the city is being developed. Sometimes, like, for example, the Great Conduit that was built in the 13th century to take water from the River Tyburn to the city, was first unearthed, I think, in the 19th century when workmen were laying a gas main. It was identified as the conduit and it was recovered over, but it was dug up yet again in the 21st century when the Crossrail works around Bond Street were taking place. So bits of London are constantly being uncovered, bits of history of London are constantly being uncovered and recovered. And here you have a photograph on the left of excavations attaching to another part of the Crossrail project. This is near Bedlam, the very first Bedlam Hospital on the way to Liverpool Street. And it is believed to be uncovering plague victims who were interred, it is believed, shortly after or during the Great Plague. But there are other graves too, and here's a picture on the right. This is from The Guardian, as you see, but a photograph of a body unearthed during the excavations of the Great Sacristy and the North Green of Westminster Abbey, and this is supposedly the skeleton of an 11th century monk. So we have plenty of human history underlying the surface, but there's a whole world hidden beneath London streets, and there is a fascination of the subterranean, especially to someone like me who is a writer of crime or mystery stories, and the hidden has got to be attractive. And Plague is about how what is unseen and subterranean mirrors and sometimes distorts the surface, both physically and metaphorically. So there is moral distortion. I mean, corruption is hidden, but we see its results. We see the incompetence and sometimes the tragedy that results from it. Crimes are by their very nature clandestine, but they change the lives of individuals and of society. And there is lots that is subterranean in SW1, not just lost rivers and burial places, but sewers, ancient and modern, lots of London Underground and plenty of other underground spaces too. So first of all, I'd like to briefly touch on the burial grounds and the plague pits. In chapter 1 of Plague, I have a character who's an archaeologist from the Museum of London, who says this: London's population expanded hugely between 1500 and 1650, and existing churchyards couldn't cope. So overspill burial grounds were created, and many of these were used to inter plague victims. One of them was the overspill ground from St Margaret's, Westminster, which is now Christchurch Gardens off Victoria Street, and that features as a place where a victim in my novel is discovered. Another is Golden Square. Now, this is less well documented by archaeologists, but it was widely believed and referred to as the site of a plague pit. So in 1685, for example, Lord Macaulay said this: "There, as in a place far from the haunts of men, had been dug 20 years before a pit into which the dead carts had nightly shot corpses. The earth was deeply tainted with infection." There are also lots of would-be plague pit sites elsewhere in central London that are not even documented in written documents, but simply in popular belief. And one of these is the Bakerloo Line depot at London Road in Lambeth, South London, and that too features in my novel. But here is a drain cover, because plague pits and burial grounds are not the only subterranean element which feature in the Plague, the novel, but also sewers. Now, this drain cover is actually in Great College Street, and it's on the border between medieval and Georgian London. And I have a question to members of the society. Actually, I know that Sue has been talking to a gentleman who I've yet to meet, called Victor, about the provenance of drain covers like this. This one is not unique. They do appear elsewhere in London, particularly in older parts of London and parts of London where there hasn't been redevelopment in recent years. And I'm sure we'll talk about them again later in the discussion. But this is what is underneath that drain cover, and this is King's Scholars Pond Sewer, also known as the River Tyburn. It gets its name, as I'm sure you're aware, from King's Scholars Pond in what was Tothill Fields, what is now Tothill Street, which is an early sewerisation of the River Tyburn. Now, I was talking with Dr. Tom Hardill of the Museum of London recently. We appeared on the same panel discussing secrets of subterranean London. He explained that the very early sewerisation of the Tyburn actually carried out by the monks of Westminster Abbey, who embanked the then river so that they could better take advantage of its flow to turn the mill on Mill Bank, which ground their flour, but which also focused the flow into the Abbey grounds itself, so that the lavatories in Westminster Abbey would be regularly cleaned. I guess what he was saying was that the monks of Westminster Abbey actually had the equivalent of flush loos long before the flushing toilet was actually invented. But you can, looking at this particular picture here, and I'm not sure how on earth to get rid of this this particular banner. I suspect it's arrived because there's so many people now watching. This particular photograph is of King's Scholars Pond Sewer, and you can see here at the base of this tunnel these blue glazed tiles. Now these are called Staffordshire blue, and they're heavy duty bricks. They're specially fired, as are these very large bricks at the base of the sewer, in order to withstand a greater flow. These were introduced into the sewer when Bazalgette incorporated the older sewer into his new sewerage systems. And this particular intersection, where there is a change in level, features rather strongly in Plague, in the plot of Plague. And this is where I have to digress a little to the memorial to Sir James Bazalgette on Victoria Embankment, because he is a particular hero of mine. I'm sure that you're already aware of his achievements. He built London's current sewage system beginning at 150 years ago. He also embanked the Thames to enable the construction of the first underground line. And he incorporated a whole range of sewers that were already in existence beforehand, as well as introducing the intersectional sewers that took the water away from those existing sewers down to the treatment plants at Abbey Mills and Beckford. He's a particular hero of mine because he had such wonderful vision. He calculated, you may know, the capacity the capacity required of London's sewage system, looking at population numbers, usage, water flow, and so on, and had sufficient vision to look forward and see that London was going to grow quite rapidly. So he doubled all his calculations, and that's in part why Bazalgette's sewers continued to service London's population, which grew by 8 million people in the time that it was that system was being used. And only now are we having the super sewer having to augment that existing system. Now, that photo, like this one, was taken last summer when I did a walk with a photographer friend following the course of the Tyburn. I've turned that into a book walk because the Tyburn also follows the locations of Plague. Now we started, and I still don't know how to get rid of this. I really don't know what to do about it. I do apologise. We started at Bond Street Tube Station, which is actually where the novel begins. And here we have, of course, the construction of the Elizabeth line, and that's why the novel starts here, because it's where the first plague pit is found, and my heroine, Cassandra, is sent there, she's a civil servant, to find out for her boss what the delay is, the latest delay in the project. And she goes down into the tube and then down further and discovers that the engineers there have found an ancient plague pit, but finds another discovery too, which is the first of the bodies. And that's me there on the right, puzzling out our route, which I hope we'll be able to follow here, even with that band across the screen. We started up here in Bond Street and then progressed along South Moulton Street, across Brook Street, Grosvenor Street, and down into Bruton Place. And the course of the Tyburn runs across Bruton Place and swings round underneath the square here into Fitzwilliam Street. Now, in the course of doing research for the book, I came across something that I wonder whether you've come across, which is the Tyburn Angling Society. I didn't know such a thing existed, but it does. And their stated aim is to uncover and rewild the Tyburn. But you only have to actually look at this map to understand that to do that, you'd have to buy up some of the most expensive real estate in Europe. But they still have this stated aim that they are going to buy up the land and open up the River Tyburn so that they can once again fish in it, because they claim fishing rights to the Tyburn going back to the time of Henry VIII. How serious that is, well, yeah, I'll leave you to determine. But the course of the Tyburn goes across Berkeley Square and down Curzon Street to this building here, which is the Third Church of Christ Scientist, and then into Half Moon Street, across the Green Park to Buckingham Palace and into St James's Park. And there's a photograph of the Third Church of Christ Scientist. It is a 20th century building, and it does have a basement. But in the novel, there are steps from that basement down to an even lower room where a gruesome discovery is made. And then we have Half Moon Street, where one of the major characters in my novel lives. You follow the course of the Tyburn, you go along Half Moon Street and then into Green Park. And I had to have a photograph both of Green Park and of St James's, because this is, of course, Thorney Island Society and the Friends of the Green Park and of St James's. But the river and its sewerized form run across Green Park and across St James's Park. And it is actually very important to the plot of Plague that the river runs across parks and is only accessible through locked manhole covers. But after getting to Buckingham Palace, whoops, that's the other way, the river divides. It goes through St James's Park, and one branch goes south to Victoria and Pimlico, and one goes through St James's Park into Tothill Street and Westminster, where it divides again. Now, there was a brief diversion on my book walk here, as you can see a photograph of me standing in Horse Guards Parade, because there is a particularly unsavoury incident that happens in the novel when my heroine is walking across Horse Guards, and she's accosted by a number of demonstrators who pour into Horse Guards from the demonstration going down Whitehall. So imagine my surprise when last August I saw photographs of this, which was a demonstration taking place in Trafalgar Square and moving down Whitehall. Now, in Plague, the demonstration is a pro-science demonstration, which is disrupted by a group of people I call anti-plague truthers or anti-plaguers, who don't believe that there is a real plague going on. Whereas in real life, of course, we have this demonstration where you have anti-mask demonstrators and anti-vaccination demonstrators. So I fear that though it's not an exact match, it does, or did at any rate to me, look like life imitating art. But I digressed slightly. I had to really, because I had to go to the Curtis Green building and New Scotland Yard. This was an annex to the Norman Shaw buildings, which were New Scotland Yard and the home to the Metropolitan Police since 1890, although they moved to Broadway back in the 1960s. And this building here, the Curtis Green building, became, amongst other things, Cannon Street Police Station. And those of you of a certain age, and any cineasts amongst you, will recognise its telephone number, which was Whitehall 1212. Often cited in policiers and black and white adventure stories of the 1950s and 60s. And an interesting little anecdote from a personal level. When I first moved to London, I was actually based in an Islington office, and not the police, but the civil service. But my telephone number was 1212. So I have a personal connection with Cannon Hill Police Station or the Curtis Green building. Of course, the Met returned here in 2013 and bought its iconic New Scotland Yard sign with it, which you can see there. And the walk goes on down the embankment past the equestrian statue of Boudicca, which also features in Plague. The door, actually, in the base of that statue, which resides behind the kiosk, features in my novel. But Boudicca's statue, of course, is famous for the other thing, which is the fact that she does appear to be controlling those rearing stallions by force of personality alone, because the sculptor didn't actually give her any reins or indeed any other form of directing her chariot. And there on the right, you have me standing in Parliament Square. It was quite hot that day, so I'm clutching my water in front of the Palace of Westminster, which is already covered in scaffolding. Now, that is actually reflected in Plague too, because I have my heroine say this: the Elizabeth Tower was shrouded in scaffolding, obscuring the clock face. Green netting was wound around the west face of St. Stephen's porch. What else enmeshed the palace and those within it? Had corruption taken hold, bringing its odour as sure as the subterranean Tyburn brought the stench of putrefaction? You're getting the picture now about what this novel is about. But here we have, slightly moving on from Parliament Square, medieval and Georgian Westminster. So you have Abingdon Green here. There's the towers of Westminster Abbey behind it, and the Jewel Tower, which also plays quite a part in the novel, because it is, of course, technically part of the Palace of Westminster, even though it is separate from it. And here you have the wall of Westminster School, which reaches down to Great College Street here on the right, and these are some of the school buildings. And it is in this street that we encountered that drain cover above the sewers. Now, I'll quickly finish on the book walk. I did create a leaflet for people to be able to follow this particular walk, and I did send a copy to Jules, so I'm sure she'll circulate it after this session is completed. But if you want to access it yourself, it's on my website, which is www.julieandersonwriter.com, and it's free to download. It is to be used with a map or an app. It doesn't come with a map. And I have to have one caveat here: it's not yet tested. I have got a group of people from the UK Crime Book Club who have volunteered to come and walk it to test it out. But I'm afraid with COVID and the lockdown, they've been unable to do that. You can find more articles on the book walk on the blog, and it touches also on the various locations that feature in the book. And just to finish off there, I did indeed also walk the southern arm by going down Tatchbrook Street through Victoria and Pimlico, and so called because it was the site of the Tatch Brook, which ran into the River Tyburn at that point before the Tyburn disgorged into the Thames opposite Nine Elms. And there is its outflow, which you can still see today from Vauxhall Bridge. Now that finishes the book walk, and I'd like now to move on to look at Thorney Island and its creation and why it is so important to my novel. This particular map is from a 19th century publication called London Without Houses, but it's quite useful in that it shows us a number of rivers before London was built. So here you have Counters Creek. Here you have the Westbourne running under Olympia and into the Thames. You have the River Fleet over here, and you can just about see the Walbrook there. And you have the Effra in the south. But here is the one we want. This is the Tyburn. It runs from Hampstead down through Mayfair, and then across what is now Mayfair and into Westminster, where it splits here just outside of Buckingham Palace, across to Westminster, where it splits again and creates the delta of Thorney Island, of the delta of the River Tyburn, created Thorney Island. Now, I'm sure I'm told that that a gentleman called Victor told you all this 2 weeks ago, so this will not be news, but you can see how certainly in this map you have Thorney Island, and here is another one. This is Thorney Island drawn onto, or rather the Westminster part of Thorney Island drawn onto the Northern map of 1593, and you can see here it runs along Tothill Street and splits. This is an approximation. It isn't entirely accurate. And one thing that does annoy me is there is actually the mill on this map, but it's cut off slightly here. So that's Millbank along here. You have Old Palace Yard. This is Westminster Palace, and here we have the Abbey, the Chapter House, and so on. North here you have what would be Portcullis. In that photograph we saw earlier, the two Norman Shaw buildings, and where the Curtis Green building is now, you have the arm of the Tyburn that exits onto the Thames at something called Garden Stairs, which transmuted into Whitehall Stairs rather later in the development of Whitehall. And this is how it maps onto the A to Z today. You can see there all those buildings and institutions of power that feature in Thorney Island. Now, Thorney Island is just going back a moment. It is or was such a concentration of settlement because it was higher, as Cassie, my heroine, says in the novel, higher than the marshlands that surrounded it, because the Thames was very marshy at this point. That is not to say that there is no subterranean on Thorney Island. There is quite a lot. There's certainly the basement of the Houses of Parliament, although frequently flooded, that does exist. And you also have the station, Westminster Tube Station. Now, originally, the district line was a cut and cover line, 1868. So that was not very deep, and it ran across Parliament Square here. However, with the construction of the Jubilee line, the planners, the engineers had to go much deeper. And of course, modern engineering techniques allow them to do that. And it is now one of the deepest lines, and it goes down 40 meters beneath Westminster, but it is a rather peculiar shape. And that's because it has two tunnels on top of one another, because there's so much else that is beneath that particular part of London, some of which we certainly don't know about. Some of which we do know about is the Westminster underground bunkers that were created just prior to the Second World War. And these, you can visit these in part as part of what used to be known as Cabinet Office War Rooms, but I think is now called Churchill's War Rooms, and they're run by the Imperial War Museum. And just before lockdown, that particular institution had an art exhibition of the art of Eric Revilius, and this is one of his paintings here. I'm a particular fan, and he painted quite a lot of pictures of the underground bunkers themselves. I don't know whether that exhibition will continue once everything opens up again. But these bunkers are an absolute maze. They were supposed to run as far south as Horseferry Road, but they have been impinged upon by a number of other constructions, including the car park for the Palace of Westminster. And they certainly feature in my novel. And there you have Winnie standing in front of the Elizabeth Tower, which is a nice segue into discussion of the Palace of Westminster and Parliament itself. I don't propose to go through the history of the palace. I'm sure that you have heard of this before and you know all about it, the building, Barry and Pugin, and of course the older segments, Westminster Hall, St Mary's Undercroft, St Stephen's Porch, and so on. But I'm not going to go into that here. What I would like to discuss briefly is the very uniqueness of this place. As you know, it has two chambers of government, the houses of the Commons and the Lords, and the chief officer of Parliament is the Speaker, with his equivalent black rod in the House of Lords. And Parliament is the legislature, the lawmaker, and it is sovereign, although it devolves some of its powers to the National Assemblies and Parliaments of Scotland, Northern Ireland and Wales. The government of the day is not sovereign. Parliament is sovereign. And we came across an example of that only recently, the first time for hundreds of years, I think, when the former Johnson administration tried to prorogue Parliament, and the Supreme Court ruled that they could not do that. Parliament itself is the only institution that can do that. The English fought a civil war over this hundreds of years ago. But what's quite interesting is that Parliament, although it makes the laws, is not actually subject to them. And this is something that the heroine explains to the detective inspector in the case in my novel. This parliamentary privilege is most notably found, and most people know about the example of being able to name wrongdoers in the chamber without fear of libel. So if you claim that someone has committed a crime, you can do so without fear of libel in the chamber of the House of Commons. But that is only one element. Technically, the law of the land does not apply within the chamber of the House of Commons. This is an historical anomaly. And interestingly, when the devolved administrations were being set up in Scotland and Wales, the civil servants who were drawing up the legislation to create those bodies were specifically instructed not to include the anomaly. So that situation does not apply in the Scottish Parliament, nor the Welsh Assembly, nor the Northern Ireland Assembly. It only applies in Westminster. And we'll talk a little more about that in a moment. But this is where power lies, and here's a picture of Central Lobby. Most people see this on television because it's where all the interviews are done when it's cold outside. When it's less so, a lot of interviews are done on Abingdon or College Green. But my novel is a novel about corruption and crime, and it's quite interesting in that the other element it touches upon is cronyism. And indeed, at one point, my heroine says to the detective inspector, not to the detective inspector, forgive me, to the villain, you're giving the contracts to your friends and allies. And we have had accusations of exactly this going on.
Julie, can I interrupt you? We just missed what you just said then. I don't know if other people, there was a bit of a break in the sound.
Okay, well, I'll go back. This slide, was it?
And just a couple of words before about who it wasn't the chief inspector she spoke to, it was someone else.
Oh, right, it was actually the villain.
Yeah.
She accuses him and says, you're giving the contracts, because there's a series of very large contracts being put out to tender in the novel, to your friends and allies, to reward your friends and allies. And of course, that cronyism is something that is a charge that has been made against the current Johnson administration in terms of contracts for PPE and other support during the COVID pandemic. So unfortunately, yet again, I found that the novel that I wrote in 2018 resonates rather more than I thought it might. But going back to the Palace of Westminster, if Whitehall is a village, then the Palace of Westminster is a hamlet all to itself. The public is familiar with the chambers and the committee rooms, with the livery of green for Commons and red for House of Lords. But it will only see the ground floor, and not all of that, because Mary's Undercroft is actually a private part of the palace. The rest of the palace has a life all of its own, and it's like a small town. It operates 24/7. It has bars, restaurants, libraries, shops, a barbers and a hairdressers, and a post office. So it really does exist of itself. I was very fortunate when I wrote Plague to have a number of parliamentarians read it, basically to check that I'd got it right. And of course, I had to have someone from the palace read it to make sure that I wasn't giving anything away, because of course the palace is still a terrorist, well, it is a terrorist target. So I didn't want to give any secure details away. But a number of parliamentarians read it for me, and one of them was Lord Collins of Highbury, who's currently, I think, opposition spokesperson for international aid and development. But he said his remark was that it was a very accurate description of Westminster, but not just that. He went on to say, especially how easy it is to get lost. And it is easy to get lost in. It has miles of corridors. But that's not something that the public ever sees. And as I've mentioned, the law as such is very strange in the Palace of Westminster. It does not apply in the same way as it applies to the rest of the United Kingdom. It does apply because it applies via the Speaker, who has a contract with the Metropolitan Police. So that the police exist and operate within the environs of the Palace of Westminster, but only via the authority of the Speaker, not via the authority of Parliament, because, as I've already said, Parliament is not subject to the law it makes. And this does throw up all sorts of anomalies. You may remember the case of Damien Green's computer. The Metropolitan Police seized it in their search for pornographic material. And the Speaker of the House who allowed that to happen was the first lady Speaker, the first woman Speaker, who subsequently left that position. And it is widely believed that it was allowing the police to do that, which was, if you like, the final reason why she was found not to be fulfilling her duties, because it is the Speaker's responsibility to maintain the rights and powers of Parliament and to allow the Metropolitan Police to seize records of one of those MPs was considered to be in breach of the responsibilities. There is a constant tension between the rights of MPs and the requirements to keep the Palace of Westminster secure, and also a constant tension between securing the palace and giving open access. It is the mother of parliaments. Citizens of the UK and indeed tourists who visit it can go around the building. And the building itself, of course, is in many ways falling down. It dates back to the 11th century. And one of the oldest parts is the Jewel Tower, which you see here, and it is separate from the Palace of Westminster, but it was built by Edward III, built on Abbey land, which was why it's so close to the Abbey itself, and it too plays a part in plague. It is, of course, the land around it is lower than the rest of Abingdon Green. And Abingdon Green and the wall that you saw there goes down as far as Great College Street, which the drain where we saw earlier, the drain cover above the sewers, and this is the old wall. So you see where much of the inspiration for plague came from, with all the dastardly doings going on in the subterranean areas beneath Westminster on Thorney Island and along the course of the Tyburn, but also because of the fairly unique legal arrangements within the Palace of Westminster, which are not widely understood. Plague is published by Claret Press. I know that Jules will send out a link if you want to buy the book. Or you can also look on the Claret Press website, and you can find my book walk leaflet on my website, or indeed look at any of the articles I've written there about doing the book walk, or about researching all the elements that we've discussed today. If you're particularly interested in subterranean London, I took part in a programme with Dr. Tom Ardhill of the Museum of London and Fiona Lucas, who's an award-winning Blue Badge guide, and we discussed not just the Tyburn and Thorney Island, but other elements, other parts of subterranean London too. Tom was the curator of the Museum of London's exhibition a couple of years ago called Rivers of London. I don't know whether any of you saw that exhibition. I did, and I'd already started to write plague at the time, but I had to then incorporate in that first chapter an archaeologist from the Museum of London. So Tom likes to think that my archaeologist in chapter 1 is actually based on him. And finally, because I have to give you a puff for my next book, which is Oracle, which is the further adventures of my heroine Cassandra Fortune, who is a civil servant working in Whitehall, and that will be published on the 5th of May. And that is the end of my talk. So I am happy to take questions from any of you, if you have any. And indeed, I have some questions for you, because I'm sure that you know an awful lot about Thorney Island that I've not managed to research. Particularly, I think that Mr. Vic Keegan, is that Victor, who you asked about my drain cover? Yeah. Because I've yet to track down the provenance of those drain covers. So it'd be very interesting to find out whether you know about that. I've got a couple of things to show you before I close, which I think you might find amusing. I've also sent to Jules a bibliography of books that I used in my research when I was researching to write the novel. One of which was this, which you may see, which is called An Underground Guide to Sewers, and I'm waving it at you because I love the title. It's an underground guide to sewers, or down, through and out in Paris and London. I think it's rather nice.
Very good.
And my other booklet to show you is this, which is a friend sent to me. And it's a guide to the Houses of Parliament, a short guide to the Palace of Westminster, revised 1949, cost 1 shilling and 6pence. So thank you for listening, and I'm happy to take your questions. I hope that you won't tax me with too much knowledge that I don't have.
Well, Julie, that was just brilliant. And just to say that I could certainly see all your pictures really clearly and nicely. I hope everyone else could. I think you were referring to some lines across, but I think we were okay.
Good.
So, Victor, I think the baton has been thrown in your direction. Oh, hang on a minute. Hang on. Oh, no.
Right, can you hear me? Yes, you probably
Yes,
can.
that's it.
Now, the drain covers are a bit of a mystery to me as well, but when Jules mentioned this morning and I was walking past Buckingham Palace, I did notice that there were a whole row of drain pipes. I don't know if you can see it, like looking like that, with no writing on at all, a whole row of them in front of Buckingham Palace, not very large. And I have no idea why. Most of the other, that they all have sort of writing on who did it and all that. But this is just a pattern, the same pattern, and all in a row just by the pavement in front of Buckingham Palace. Do you know anything about that?
No, I don't. I've asked a number of people. I've contacted the local authority and a number of historical societies, trying to track down the provenance of the one in Great College Street. And I'm told that they're not unique. You can find them in other parts of London, usually where the medieval and the Georgian come together, but only in places that haven't been developed since. And the closest I can get, because they don't have those particular ones, I suspect, like the ones that you found this morning outside Buckingham Palace, also don't have any markings on them. And the closest I could get to any sort of answer was that it was thought that these were actually made by local blacksmiths at the time. So they didn't belong to any municipality, if you like. They weren't local authority or water company or anything like that. They predate those and therefore don't have any insignia on them. And that's the closest I could get, I'm afraid.
Yes, it's curious. It's what's under the line. Why is it in a straight line? I don't understand. It can't be the sewer because they're too narrow to get down.
Yeah, no, I don't know.
Yeah.
But I hadn't seen them, and I will go and look at them. So thank you for that anyway.
Well, I hadn't noticed those ones in Great College Street, so I'll certainly, when I'm next up that way, yeah, everybody always says, oh, you must look up when you're walking around London, but not so.
Oh, I think you must look up too. I'm a great looker-upper, but you know, I think, I mean, certainly writing Plague, I look down an awful lot because there's so much that's under there, and we walk over it every day, and we don't realise what's there half the time.
Yeah.
There is a tunnel from St James's Park Station to the new cafe on the corner, where just opposite the Treasury, where Birdcage Walk meets the Horse Guard Road. And there's a
Storey's Gate.
There's Storey's Gate. That's right. And there's an exit from one of the platforms in St James's Park in Westminster Station. I think to enable the police to make a quick getaway or something like that.
Right.
There are other ones.
Sorry.
There's other one going from underneath the old Scotland Yard to the Houses of Parliament. Originally built as part of the Opera House that was being built there, so that MPs and aristocracy and peers could get back to their seats when the division bell rang.
I was astonished. When I was doing the research for the book, one of the people who I had the good fortune to talk to was a former Deputy Sergeant at Arms of the Palace of Westminster, who said when he actually took over, one of his responsibilities was to review the security of the palace. and he discovered that that tunnel underneath Bridge Street actually appeared on maps. So the first thing he tried to do was actually expunge it from any maps that he could get hold of. Yeah. Certainly the ones that are on the internet. Now, it's an impossible task, of course, but if you actually look at old maps, you can actually see that the bridge is, the tunnel is marked. It goes from the palace underneath Bridge Street.
I hadn't realised that.
It's such a security risk. I actually have the policeman in the novel say what Mike Narowinski, who was the Deputy Sergeant at Arms who I spoke to, said to me, which is, you know, security for this place is impossible, because it is.
Bit of a large question, but I was just wondering how you kind of, if you can sort of say something about the process of turning research, sometimes which can be quite dry, into something really exciting to read and into a novel form. I was wondering if you can say a bit about the process that you went through to write the novel in that sense.
Well, I mean, research is a sort of novelist's quagmire, really, because you can spend so much time doing research, especially if, like me, you're a history geek, because it's enjoyable in itself, and you have to constantly remind yourself that this is research in the service of the story. It's not something, I mean, it is, of course, it's interesting, but otherwise you end up going down all sorts of rabbit holes and spending lots and lots and lots of time, and you have to constantly bring yourself back to the narrative, and I think that's sort of good advice for any writer, in terms of whether it's to do with character development, whether it's to do with historical research or anything else. It all everything has to be in the service of the story, and it's something that you have to constantly remind yourself. And I am appallingly bad, because I put too much in. I know I do. The first draft always has far too much detail about the history, and I've begun, because this is my first crime thriller. I used to write historical adventure stories, and I've learnt, this is my third book, that actually you can't allow it to get in the way. However interesting you find it, and however interesting your readers might find it, actually what they're reading for is the story, it's the narrative, and you can't let it get in the way of that. And I now know enough to, when I've finished the first draft, I go back and go through, and one of the things I always look for is having too much historical detail. And you can see it in other people's books sometimes, and you think that should have been edited out. There are too many facts. It's also interestingly, it's also a trait of biographers who subsequently write novels. You can see it in their novels too, that they're used to including fact in what they write, and so they incorporate too much in the sort of finished novel product. So essentially, I followed Orwell's dictum. If it doesn't move the story on, either in terms of character or in terms of plot, then it shouldn't be there. Colour is all very well, and it's nice to have, and I think certainly as a novelist, place is very, very important to me. But I like to ground my books in the place in which they're set, even if that is 13th century Spain, which is, well, I used to write historical books, as I said beforehand. But and of course you need historical detail in which to do that, but actually you have to use that in the service of the story. And you have to just go back and edit and remove and take all these lovely, glorious bits of detail out a lot of the time. If you can't work them in as part of the story, they don't belong there. Does that answer your question?
That's a great answer. I think Lucy's got a question.
Yeah, I think you said that the basement of the Houses of Parliament were often flooded.
Yes.
How deep are they, and how often does that happen?
An awful lot. Have you ever been down into the basement?
No, no.
Well, it is this huge cavernous space which has sort of concrete blockhouses here and there, and lots and lots of pipework. If you talk to members of the craft team, and they're the team that maintain the structure, the internal structure of the Palace of Westminster, they will tell you that there's enough pipework for at least 3 systems, because both the water and electricity systems within the Palace of Westminster have been augmented over the years. So you've got more and more bits added on, but they've never actually completely overhauled the entire system. So you've got lots of pipe work down there as well. And it floods on a regular basis, but then the whole of the Palace of Westminster floods. It leaks like a sieve. Water is constantly coming through the roof into the chambers. Most of the when the Parliament is in recess, if you take a tour round the main chambers, you will see works going on, because that's the point at which the craft team can get in there and repair the roof and the floor and so on. And they're a wonderful group of people. They do feature in the novel because they live down in the basement, oddly enough, in one of those concrete block houses that I've been describing. Now, I've never been into their workroom. It is a place of myth and legend, I have to say. There be dragons, but it does feature. I've made it in the book. I've made it into a sort of clubhouse. You know, like a gentleman's club. I don't know what it's like down there, but that's what I've done with it. I hope that they're happy with it. But there are some wonderful stories about the craft team who are a bit like the sort of, I don't know, the sort of engineers mess in the Navy. You know, these are the people who really think they run the place. So I was told a wonderful tale by Mike Nowinski, who was the Sergeant at Arms, Deputy Sergeant at Arms, when President Obama came to visit. And if you remember, he addressed both houses of Parliament, and he had with full security detail. And when Obama and the First Lady were about to leave, they'd lost one of the security detail. They couldn't find him. And Mike, who was giving a tour for many of the security men around the Palace of Westminster at the time, had a good idea where this security man might have gone. And he was discovered in the craft team's workshop, having imbibed rather a lot of the craft team's hospitality, because they are well known for keeping a very well-stocked bar in their underground lair. So this secret serviceman was probably hauled up back into daylight and packed off with his Secret Service colleagues, because he'd fallen foul of the hospitality of the craft team in the basement of the Palace of Westminster, which I thought was a wonderful story.
Yeah, great story,
isn't it?
But going back to flooding, so it's presumably the water is from the rain coming in and the river wall as well, or just mostly rain coming in?
I think it's rain coming in mostly, because they did bolster up the foundations, but I mean the whole thing, as we know, is being completely refurbished, redone, and it needs it, because it was in a pretty dire state.
Well, we're kind of interested because there's a scheme for the Holocaust Memorial in Victoria Tower Gardens, which is all going to be underground, and you know, if the water's getting in through if any water is getting in through the river wall, that has great implications for an entirely underground centre.
Absolutely.
Gardens. Yeah.
I would imagine that with modern engineering techniques, rather like the, you know, the basement of, well, the Westminster station, which is, you know, 40 metres below the surface. I mean,
yeah. It's really when the river gets very high.
I guess so.
Yeah. Anyway, thank you.
I can't really answer the question because I don't know.
Yeah.
Could I just ask quickly, does your protagonist, does she have a job like you had a job in the Palace of Westminster?
I didn't actually have a job in the Palace of Westminster. I worked in a number of different government departments on Whitehall and NGOs. So I was regularly in the palace, seeing my minister, though I never actually did box duty, which was always something which terrified me. You know, the civil servants who sit in the box behind the minister when they're talking, passing notes to make sure that that they can answer questions and so on. So I didn't actually work I wasn't on the Palace of Westminster staff. I worked in Whitehall, though I did spend quite a lot of time in the Palace of Westminster. My protagonist is with the Office of the Deputy Prime Minister, as indeed I was for a time, and is therefore based in what was the old Admiralty building on Whitehall. But you know, like anyone who works in any of those departments at a fairly senior level, spends quite a lot of time in the Palace of Westminster.
Okay, thank you. That's so interesting. Well, certainly I'm going to, we're going to circulate a link to your book, but yeah, the special rules that apply there and nowhere else, and yeah, intriguing, and maybe answers a lot of our questions.
It is, isn't it? I mean, people are aware of parliamentary privilege in terms of, you know, the freedom from libel prosecution. You know, that's the area that gets most publicity, but that's only the one aspect of it. It applies to law. Parliament makes the laws; it is not subject to them.
Yeah,
which is very unusual. Though of course the law is applied because it's applied via the Speaker, who employs the Metropolitan Police in order to police the palace in the same way as it polices other parts of London. Okay,
so I can just imagine your book really pushes that, and you've set some awful crimes up in the palace, and all sorts of cover-ups. So it's really exciting. Sounds great.
Well, I'm glad you like the sound of it. I mean, there are genuinely differences in the security of the palace because of that. Not something that, you know, one particularly harps on, but I say,
yeah,
there is a very large.
You've been joined by someone just before bedtime, I think.
Yeah.
Met police Teddy.
Okay. Hi, Teddy. Oh, policeman.
Ah,
okay, very appropriate.
Absolutely. But it's interesting that, I mean, for example, large parts of the palace have no CCTV coverage, certainly not in the private areas. So because the MPs will not allow themselves to be overwatched, and they regard that as their right as members of Parliament. And you can imagine the headache that causes for anyone with responsibility for security of the place. But that's how it is.
Yeah, hopefully there aren't too many pickpockets around these days. As we're cashless society.
Well, yeah. I mean, but to be fair, pickpockets couldn't get into the private areas of the Palace of Westminster unless they had Palace of Westminster passes. So, I mean, the public areas are all covered by CCTV.
Mm-hmm.
So, you know, where the general public can visit, the security is more like you would imagine. But I remember the Deputy Sergeant at Arms I spoke to, or the former Deputy Sergeant at Arms I spoke to, fulminating heartily on the fact that certain modern department stores have better security coverage in terms of CCTV than does the Palace of Westminster.
Yeah.
Julie, we've got a question. How long did it take you to write the book?
About I guess from the very start. I started doing the research in 2018, and that was when in the autumn, and it was published in September 2020. Though it was indeed ready for publication in the spring, but of course with COVID everything was deferred. So about 18 months is the answer.
And I'd ask a question myself, actually. It follows on from Teddy Bear question, Elm, about the process of writing. I mean, how much of yourself is included in the book, and how do you decide what experience you're going to leave out? In the same way, it's quite difficult to cut down a historical detail. I think it must be equally difficult to cut down on your personal experience.
I think that's what being a professional writer means, in a way. The characters in the book are fictional products of my imagination. They're characters. They're not me. They are separate from me. I can place the characters in the world that I know well, and that I can use my knowledge and experience to allow them to populate that world and to allow them to experience that world in the way that I did. But actually, those individuals, if you like, fictional individuals, are not me. They're entirely separate from me. And it's actually quite interesting that you mentioned that. I think when we were talking yesterday, one of the things that I'm constantly asked is Cassandra, my heroine, your alter ego? And the answer is no. She's a fictional character. She's not me at all. But she inhabits the world that I inhabited, and therefore experiences some of the things that I experienced. But she is a completely different animal to the writer. The characters are completely different animals to their creators. They just, that's what being a professional writer means. This isn't autobiography, and I think it's a common misconception that writers create characters in their own image. In my experience, anyway, and talking to other writers, they don't. Because you're creating a complete whole, a narrative whole, and the characters within that have a part to play. So they are not you, they belong to the book, not to you. Does that answer your question?
Yes, it does. Thank you. It's always interested me, that one. Yeah. Have we got any more questions? Then I would thank you all for coming, and thank Julie hugely for a fascinating talk. And for me, there were lots of riveting details and insights in which those of us who've never worked within the palace would never have an idea. So thank you very much, Julie. We'll be sending out further details, and if anyone has any other questions that they think about afterwards, just write to Jules or myself, and we'll include those in an email to Julie. Could I just ask, before I ask a thank you, everyone just to applaud and thank Julie, just to mention our next talk in 2 weeks' time, because Jules keeps us to a relentless schedule. It's on the 23rd of March, and it's the restoration of the Queen Anne state bed given by one of our members, John Turpin. And I'm certainly hoping for some tips on restoration, which I won't follow necessarily. But anyway, can I ask us to put our hands together and thank Julie hugely?
Lovely. Thank you very much.
It's my pleasure. Thank you. And thank you too for researching the drain cover, even if we didn't actually get an answer. I'll have to carry on with that one, I think.
We'll find out some more for you too, Julie. That's absolutely terrific. Thank you. And thank you, everyone.